Hey, Christian.
Hey, how are you?
I'm great.
I have some follow-up questions to our last conversation.
Okay, let's hear it.
So we were talking about C.S. Lewis and the Four Loves and some of the things that he brings up in there. And one of the quotes that he says quotes Kipling and he says, "If England was what England seems, how quick we'd drop her, but she ain't." And basically, oh, if my country was as bad as you say, I wouldn't be so supportive or loving or encouraging, but she's not that bad, or this is the good part. And that started reminding me of, the people here that are so patriotic, they love America so much, um, but they don't seem to love a lot of the people in it. And I'm thinking of,
Right.
those that are poor or those that are immigrants or those that maybe, are ill. They
Yeah.
just don't seem as compassionate as I would think they should be. And I don't understand how we got here.
Okay, so man, there's a lot to unpack with that one. The first thought that comes to my mind is back in my more pastoral days when I used to do premarital counseling with some regularity. One of the standard questions I would ask couples after we'd gotten to know each other over a couple months and I've spent some time with them, I would ask them, tell me what you love about the other person. Why are you getting married? And you get all the fluffy, wonderful, great things about the other person. And then I would turn around and say, okay, tell me something that you really don't like about the other person. And it was a litmus test for me because if they couldn't articulate anything meaningful that they didn't like about the other person, it was an indicator to me that they weren't really in love with a real person.
Hmm.
They were in love with an image of a person. And they hadn't yet been together long enough to really uncover what they didn't like. As we know within marriage, those things will become apparent over time. And it's often traumatic if you can't identify those negative things before you're married, because then they come as a shock after you're married. And it's a sign of an immature relationship. And I think for some folks in their patriotism, it's like that. If they can't identify the negative things about their country and choose to love it anyway, it's not a mature patriotism. It's an immature one. But then, secondly, I think we really, and this is where I think a lot of the church has gotten away from a scriptural definition, but we need to define what we mean by love. The best definition I've come across, at least a Christian definition of love, was from Dallas Willard. And he talks about how love is not a feeling, it's not an emotion, it's not, the warm fuzzies. He said, love is to will the good of another, to want what is really, I mean, you've parented four boys, you know this deeply, right? There are moments where love compels you to do things your son doesn't want you to do, but you know that it is what is good for him, right? And any loving parent is going to do things their kid hates because you know it's good for them. That's love. And I mean, the ultimate example is the cross, right? Jesus' disciples did not want him to go to the cross. And Peter, even when he hears about this plan, Peter's like, it'll never happen. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, right? Because it was his love that compelled him to do this thing that even his own disciples didn't want him to do because he knew it's what's best. That's what love does. It's a choice. And patriotism, if we see it as love for one's country, means seeing the truth about my country, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and then choosing to do what is best and loving for that country, but it has to be a Christian definition of love. And that's where I think a lot of the so-called Christian patriots are off track. Because when I look at the Gospels and I look at the New Testament, I look at Scripture in general, a country that learns to value every human being, including the poor, including the immigrant, including the marginalized, that is good for America. And yet so many in this patriot movement want to say, no, let's kick them all out. We don't have to pay attention to certain groups of people. We don't have to look at systemic injustice. And it's true on the left too. I mean, there are folks on the left who don't care at all about the unborn or aren't concerned about certain segments of the country. And a Christian response to them would be like, no, what's good for America is that we value life wherever it might be. So we have to, number one, see America as it truly is, good, bad, and ugly. Number two, get our definition of love from what Christian faith defines it as, not as Western consumer culture does. And then third, realize that it's action. It's the will to pursue what's good for America, not just aligning with a certain political party or denouncing the libs or owning the libs or something crazy like that. And I think on all three of those fronts, a lot of folks are off track. We don't see the country clearly. We're not defining love based on scripture, and we make it into an emotional sentimentalism rather than an act of the will.
Well, and that's what's so confusing with how we've gotten here, because as I've learned on the podcast, Christians began the things that helped the poor. The
Right.
organizations, the schools. That was initially our role in society, and I don't understand how we've gotten to this place where it's people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps, or
Yeah. I think the argument I bump into, especially on social media when these topics come up from Christians, isn't that they don't care about the poor or the sick or whoever it might be. Their argument is the federal government shouldn't be the one doing it, right? The churches should be doing it. If the churches did it, then the government wouldn't have to do it. And I, okay, I get that argument, but I think it's a pretty naive argument. I mean,
in
did
what
you know
way?
that even the concept of insurance was invented by Presbyterians in Scotland a couple hundred years ago? And
I did not know this.
the whole idea of insurance was we have widows in this community whose husbands are obviously dead, and in that time they couldn't earn much money. So let's pool our money so if your husband dies, we have a way of caring for a widow. That's where insurance came from. Now you expand that idea to 350 million people, including those who aren't necessarily members of a church or in a Christian community. And it's just simply insurance is a way of loving our neighbors. It's a way of ensuring that when hardship falls on my neighbor, they're not destitute. But it's because we're once removed. Like if my neighbor's house burns down, his house is right outside my office window here. If his house burns down, yeah, I'm going to help him as much as I can. But I don't have the resources to buy him a new house. And even if everyone on my neighborhood got some money together, we probably wouldn't have enough money to buy him a new house. That's where insurance comes in. And so my contribution to my own homeowner's insurance policy helps him if his house burns down. And same thing with health insurance. So there's this argument from Christians like, well, we shouldn't need insurance. We shouldn't need a healthcare policy and all this stuff because the church should just be doing that. I'm like, well, you know what? If we were 300 people living in a hamlet somewhere and everyone went to church, that makes sense. But we're 350 million people. And somehow we still have to figure out a way to care for our neighbors. And so maybe we do need the government. But no one says that about like the government shouldn't be paving roads or having armies and tanks and weapons. So, but when it comes to other things, suddenly some Christians get bent out of shape saying the
Well,
government shouldn't
why?
do that
But why?
because it's good politics.
It sells, you're
It
saying.
sells. Yeah, it sells. Um, the other thing, I just heard this on an interesting podcast I was listening to, and I know you love talking about the Reagan era. Ronald Reagan was a really transformative figure, obviously, for conservative politics and the Republican Party. And he came in onto the scene and started questioning some more liberal democratic dogma, right, about government and welfare and some of these other things. And I think some of what he said made a lot of sense. But the argument that this podcast was making is the Republican Party got so enamored with what Reagan was able to achieve 40 years ago that they started taking some of his sensible arguments, but then going a step further and then a step further and then a step further. So one of Reagan's core principles was government's too big, right? We need to shrink the size of government. And I think coming out of the New Deal and LBJ's Great Society and all those programs, you could make a case that, okay, maybe the government is too big and we need to reduce it. And it worked, like it sold. People bought that rhetoric. But then in the 90s and 2000s and 2010s and now the 2020s, in order to keep getting people hooked on the idea, you have to go to even more extremes with it. So it isn't just that the government's too small or too big, like the Republican who promises to decimate the most of the government is the one who's going to get elected. Or the one who says, back in the 1980s, Reagan may have critiqued some Democrats for being a little too socialist in their policies. Well, now you have to say they're not just a little socialist, they're flat out Marxists. Right? You have to take everything to an extreme. And it's no longer enough to try to think of another example. It's no longer like Reagan famously reformed the immigration policy of the United States, and he made a pathway for citizenship for some people who were here in an undocumented way. That was seen as a conservative approach to immigration 35 years ago. Well, go over 35 years, and the approach to immigration has become not just build a wall, but let's kick out the 12 million undocumented people. Like everything gets taken to an extreme. So what begins as a thoughtful, sensible, conservative policy ends up in absurdity. And the same happens on the left, not to, pick on that side
Well,
too.
you bring this up, and of course, I have firsthand experience during that Reagan era. Um, and what's interesting is I vividly remember that because I would go into some of these departmental building. Like vividly remember going into the Department of Housing and Urban Development (HUD) because one of my closest friends with Judith Kemp and her father was the head of HUD at that time. And I went in there, and there were just a lot of people that worked there that really weren't working so hard. And there seems to be so many of them. It just did seem not very streamlined, not very efficient. And that's true. We find that all over government. You go into any government agency, the DMV or whatnot, and it's very long lines, and it does take a lot of time. And there's a lot of people that don't look like they're working very hard because they have government benefits, they're secure in their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And that lent to the idea that government is too big and it doesn't work. So the only way to reform it, and it's crazy, but I mean, I saw it happening in the Trump administration, we're going to put people in the heads of these organizations that are going to dismantle it from within. And they did that by not putting people in leadership positions and just firing everybody. And that seemed to be the solution for big government or bloated government but what we saw that actually did in practicality is government ground to a halt. Nothing really got accomplished.
Yeah.
And there's got to be some balance somewhere.
But when just to be kind of cynical and political about it, it's actually a brilliant strategy on the part of Republicans. And I think Newt Gingrich was really the one who first innovated this back in the 1990s and the government shutdown that happened when he was Speaker of the House and Bill Clinton was president. Because if you've built your party platform on the idea that the federal government doesn't work, and then you put people and policies in place that actually break the federal government so it doesn't work more, then you can go back to your constituency, see, it's still not working. And you can whereas the Democrats have more or less built their platform on, we need good government. We need functional government. So anytime there is dysfunction in government, it's a win for the Republicans. And when their strategies make it more dysfunctional, like a government shutdown, they can just go, see, government's terrible. And it's a win-win for them every time. And that's not something available to the Democrats as a strategy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. The frustrating thing is I sure would love to know how to make a change.
Well, I mean, we could maybe talk about that on another Christian Asks, but I think there are some really practical things that could change in our political system that would prevent the kind of polarization and extremism that we're seeing today. We didn't get here out of nowhere, and there were deliberate things that were done and could be undone that have actually nothing to do with who do you vote in or out of office, but some structural changes in the way we elect our representatives that I think, and even the way we nominate candidates for president in our parties, that could change things dramatically. But there's no incentive to do that from within those parties.
Oh, man.
Anyway, we've gotten off on an interesting rabbit trail here.
Well, I thank you for answering my questions. I appreciate your time.
No, it's fun. Always.